Thank you, Dan. And it was such a treat, the first hour of this conversation, really, so many ideas, so much commitment, and a diversity of views. And that's precisely what our coalition is about, is to create a platform for creative, bold, and diverse ideas on how to contribute to give wings and feet to the proposals made in the Our Common Agenda report by the Secretary General. So thank you very much for a very fruitful first hour. We will move into the second hour, and basically the focus in this second part of the conversation is sustainable finance, and of course something that is absolutely critical, especially as we craft a new social contract, which is building trust. And the guiding questions are the same: identifying priorities, discussing the content, the need for sequencing, etc. Areas where you see that there are gaps, things that are missing in the report and that we should bring in. And of course, what are the next steps, how to strategize together, what is the strategy and what is the tactics, especially as we think or imagine the best outcomes for the proposed summits, this year's Education Summit, the Summit for the Future in 2023, and the World Social Summit in 2025. And basically, the two issues where we would like to put more emphasis now is the issue of financing for development, the money, what is happening as we recover from COVID. We heard loud and clear from Agustina what is happening with the world economy, in a way, with the growth index. We see that countries of the North mostly are growing to increase their GDPs in 4.4% approximately. In emerging economies like China, almost 5%, India, 9%. But the concern here is that none of these projected GDP growth is going to translate into more equality or more sustainability. So I think that one of the issues that perhaps we can address today is the quality of growth. And of course, what the Club de Madrid also and many of you have been discussing for a long time is how to go beyond GDP. So basically, what again, even in the recovery of COVID, we will see inequalities just grow further. Global South are expected to decrease in 2022, especially low and middle income countries with a huge debt burden. And our colleague from Uruguay mentioned that very clearly for the case of Argentina. But let's just keep in mind that middle income countries, most of countries in my own region in Latin America, middle income countries represent the debt burden represent 96% of the total public debts of developing countries. And the debt service in our countries, in middle income countries, represent almost half of the exports of all exports of goods and services. And that was only last year. So, and we have been discussing the need for a profound global tax reform, a new deal to fight illicit financial flows and tax havens, and the need, there's now a group seriously working on the need to rethink the Bretton Woods institutions. And we have reasons for that. We heard one of the speakers today. And the second issue perhaps is the issue of trust and how trust is eroding our democracies. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer report, from just the end of last year, we see that globally the trust in democracies is as low as 57%, if I recall well, and government leaders 42%. In Latin America, unfortunately, appears again as the most distrustful region of the world compared to regions such as Africa, Asia, the Arab countries. And on average, Latin America has 20% less trust in institutions and governments than other regions of the world. That is absolute. It's really a reason of concern. And we see that Latin America is also one of the most unequal regions in the planet. So apparently the issue of trust and inequalities perhaps can be considered together. So these are perhaps some of the issues that I'm sure we're going to listen from our two stellar speakers today. Mandip Tiwana, he's the Chief Programs Officer of Civicus, and I would give you the floor immediately, Mandip, and then we will go to Maria Teresa after you. But you have the floor, Mandip.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and also stalwarts of the discourse on our common agenda. Thank you very much to the Coalition for UN We Need and others for organizing this event. So I just wanted to begin with a premise and for us to just take stock of where we are. So we are almost at the half point of Agenda 2030. And if we look at Agenda 2030 and we look at the Sustainable Development Discourse, it was supposed to be extremely unique in its understanding of what development could be, with its emphasis on the three pillars of sustainable development: the economic dimension, the social dimension, and the environmental dimension. But we perhaps need to have a more realistic assessment of how much progress has been made. And oftentimes it happens at high-level political forums that we have governments coming and speaking about the progress that they've been able to make, and sometimes in very glowing terms, but the truth and the reality on the ground seems to point to an alternative direction. And here I just wanted to share a few things. The Global Inequality Report, and as you rightly pointed out, Ms. Espinosa, inequality remains a huge challenge of our time. The Global Inequality Report, which has been produced by 100 researchers working over the last 4 years, say that income inequality is so stark that it's almost at levels of at the beginning of the 20th century, when Western imperialism was at its zenith. So 10% of the world's population now are able to capture 52% of the world's income. And the bottom 50% of the world's population have only 8% of the world's income, which is a huge, huge challenge. And I think it's also a setback for all the technological and scientific progress we claim to have made, when 811 million people go to bed hungry every night, according to the World Food Program. We have huge issues as far as conflict and forcible displacement is concerned. The UNHCR estimates that 82 million forcibly displaced people are currently exist around the world, which I would say is probably a conservative estimate. And despite the commitment in Agenda 2030 to participatory, responsive, and inclusive decision-making, to access to information and fundamental freedoms, to effective partnerships with civil society, global civic space conditions which allow civil society to be equal partners are extremely challenging. According to our own research at Civicus, just 3.1% of the world's population live in countries where the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are adequately protected. This remains a huge challenge. On the climate emergency, it's been highlighted at the UN from time to time, and there's a lot of talk at the UN about addressing climate change, but we still find that from the Arctic to the Amazon, environments, our ecology is being destroyed. People who depend on natural resources for their livelihoods are now are having to make way because large agri companies, large mining projects continue to act with impunity, and oftentimes due to the political patronage they enjoy. So we really have a huge challenge that is facing us at the moment with regards to implementation of Agenda 2030 when these conversations are happening with the OCA. Now, one of the topics of today's conversation is about financing for development. And I'd say there's a very simple solution if the UN wants to address on financing for development. Global military spending is almost $2 trillion per annum. Despite the pandemic, despite all the challenges that people were facing, from unemployment, from hunger, from starvation, from unequal access to vaccines, global military spending has continued to rise, and it is actually creating a huge challenge at the moment due to the conflict. The specter of conflict remains, but whether in Europe or whether in Asia, and if the UN member states want to do something about it, they can reduce a certain percentage of their global military spending and give an undertaking and divert that money to bettering people's life rather than creating weapons of war, which also give opportunities to the military industrial complexes to engage in grand corruption. So there's a simple solution there, really, if we really want to free up money for sustainable development. And I'd say that this is a better solution than the UN going to billionaire philanthropists, billionaire companies, and those companies then providing solutions, but solutions that are in exchange for them underwriting certain development.
Hello? Mandip? Mandip, are you still with us? Is it just me or you froze?
We can't hear.
Maria, I'll text Mandeep and see what's happening. But meanwhile, maybe we could move to the next speaker or something.
Yeah, he's dropped off. So
I was also trying to text him actually, but yes, let's make the best of the time we have. So if you allow me, I will give the floor to Maria Teresa Nera Loron, advisor for the UN program at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So you have the floor, and then we will give back the floor to Mandip when he reconnects. Okay, so Maria Teresa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Espinosa. Good evening to friends and colleagues, and I'm joining you from Manila, Philippines, where it is almost midnight. Thank you for this invitation and the opportunity to contribute to the conversations around the UNGA discussions of OCA. So the recent pronouncements from the UNSG lays clear the imperatives of the situation the world finds itself in, as well as what needs to be done to rebuild and flourish with the OCA as a roadmap for the future. 3 years into this unprecedented, multiple and intersecting crisis exacerbated by the pandemic, the OCA should be able to generate a lot of excitement, optimism, and trust that would mobilize support across a broad range of actors. As an activist from the Global South, as a woman and a mother whose lived reality is that of perpetual insecurity over the future, with chronic poverty, unemployment, landlessness, inaccessibility of privatized basic services, lack of social protection, displacement from climate impacts and development projects that extract our resources, and repression staring at us in the face for speaking truth to power, I have held on to the belief that if everyone gets their acts together to do the right thing, we can all not just imagine, but actually realize a better, more sustainable future. Today's global challenges are enormous and needs to be addressed urgently and concurrently. And there's no doubt that the structural and systemic transformations required to tackle this crisis, eliminate inequality, and achieve universal human rights can only happen through forms of multilateralism that guarantee democracy, human rights, and dignified lives for present and future generations. But unfortunately, it's also clear that multilateralism continues to fall short in addressing the inequalities arising from unequal power relations between the global south and the global north, within our societies, and between women and men. We know that the current system of global governance is a complex, multi-layered system of norms, institutions, and treaties that should be mutually reinforcing, but they're frequently competing or even conflicting. So the multilateral system is a mixed affair with inherent contradictions and tensions, as highlighted by competing multilateral frameworks and institutions, where we often see, for instance, human rights and environmental protection obligations of states are stifled by trade and investment regimes that destroy the environment and displace communities. Unfulfilled commitments to deliver on global public goods with a global financial architecture that allows for tax avoidance and illicit financial flows, and the unrealized aspiration of economic and social development and shared prosperity with certain multilateral institutions that have a separate set of rules imposing unjust macroeconomic policies on developing countries. We need a much more effective, coherent, democratic, and accountable multilateralism, one that would create coherence between the different frameworks, transform these when needed, and rebalance the power and dominance of rich countries and their corporations. OCA is huge. And civil society across the world have raised serious concerns on the OCA, particularly on how it sees the process of transformation happening. Now, there's a real and present danger that instead of reaffirming the role of universal and democratic intergovernmental processes, this concept of network multilateralism could further undermine the UN, bringing to the policy decision-making table duty bearers, rights holders, and corporate interests alike, and assuming that they are equal stakeholders, conceal the deeply ingrained inequalities of power and voice between these actors, and creating new processes even while there are dedicated intergovernmental forums that exist does not help strengthen nor reinvigorate multilateralism. So what is needed is inclusive multilateralism that ensures intergovernmental negotiations on key global challenges are transparent and accessible to people who can hold their governments accountable to ensure ambitious decisions and actions. Now, the proposals around reforming the global economic and financial architecture were for sure done with the best intentions. But allow me to be provocative, so is the road to hell. Now, for instance, the existing FFD process is already mandated to address urgent global systemic challenges on debt, international tax, and illicit financial flows, finance, ODA, trade, technology, financial record regulation. The FFD process also recognizes these international financial institutions, civil society, and private sector as stakeholders for inputs, while ensuring that negotiations are clearly intergovernmental with member states as decision makers. Now, there was a 2009 FFD conference on the world economic crisis and its effects on developing countries. This was a direct response to the global economic crisis then. The challenge, therefore, is not the lack of existing processes to convene, but the need to overcome the obstinate blocking from a handful of member states in the UN who prefer such decision-making to happen in undemocratic forums rather than the UN. So the urgent need, therefore, is to ensure democratization of global economic governance, such as the need for a global debt workout mechanism at the UN, establishing a universal UN Intergovernmental Tax Commission, and a global technology assessment mechanism at the UN. The SG himself stated this in his report. Economic governance is driven disproportionately by a small number of states and financial actors and is siloed from other areas of international agenda setting and decision making. But instead of taking steps to democratize global economic governance. He proposes a biennial summit between the G20 and the ECOSOC, SGs, and heads of IFIs. Well, we don't need to create a new process for this, as FFD is already mandated to address these challenges on sovereign debt without looking at these issues in silos, but as interconnected with other systemic issues in the FFD agenda. We've seen just last year evidence of how leaving sovereign debt discussions in the hands of a few countries, mainly lenders, is a sure formula for failure to address the profound reforms needed in the international financial architecture. None of these much lauded initiatives are debt cancellations. They are merely suspensions, with many debt payments still due to be paid in the coming years. This, even though much of developing countries' debts are illegitimate, colonial legacies, were lent irresponsibly and unfairly to finance harmful projects, and policies such as fossil fuel industries were driven by predatory lending with onerous and unjust terms, while often failing to comply with legal requirements and human rights principles. Many of these debts are also in contrast with the historical, social, climate debt owed by rich and developed countries to the global south because of centuries of colonization, plunder, and exploitation. Developing countries were able to push for a 2014 UNGA resolution committing the UN to work towards creating a multilateral legal framework for a debt workout mechanism. But then all these efforts have been hampered by lack of cooperation from the G7 governments and others. Developing countries have also proposed that the UN Committee on Tax be transformed into a global inclusive norm-setting body for international tax cooperation. This is an outcome from the Addis Ababa FFD that was rejected by rich countries who wanted to keep decision-making power over global tax governance behind closed doors. So we call on the leadership of the SG and member states to instead focus on the clear call of the developing countries to establish this universal intergovernmental UN tax body and negotiate a UN tax convention. Reforming GDP is not just about changing an economic indicator to include the value of unpaid care work and informal economy within the existing growth fixated economic models. No, I think the conversations around reforming GDP should be about the structural transformation away from extractive and exploitative economic models that deny women and girls equitable access to quality public services and goods. It's about the needed policy responses that look at redistributing unpaid and paid domestic work and investing in the strengthening of the care economy. This implies providing sufficient financing for gender-responsive public services. Last point, in the last several decades, TNCs have emerged as the most powerful non-state actor operating nationally and globally, and they can even sue governments, no? But increasingly, corporations are presented by governments and multilateral institutions as indispensable partners in development. But realigning business models to sustainable development will not happen through voluntary approaches. It requires a new set of bold public norms, policies. It requires the affirmation of the role of the state in defining a new set of global rules that uphold the centrality of human rights. So we need the leadership of the SG to call on the governments to regulate businesses, including through engaging constructively in the ongoing development in the Human Rights Council towards an international legally binding instrument on transnational corporations and other businesses. Now, these above proposals might not transform multilateralism immediately and completely into the way we want it to be, but they are proposals that are beginnings with important elements that can contribute to building trust and broader ownership of the agenda. They are actionable when there is political will and can inspire innovative thinking and ideas. Many are primarily the duties of different levels of government and multilateral institutions, but it can be propelled into reality by campaigning and mobilization of civil society and social movements around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa. Certainly a very, very comprehensive package of ideas and concrete proposals. Thank you for reminding us the often colliding international regimes, between environmental international regimes, human rights regimes, with trade, investment, intellectual property a regime, the urgent need to democratize the international financial architecture, and to basically comply with the Addis Ababa action agenda and what we have already agreed, but perhaps go beyond. I was myself, as ambassador to the UN, very active in this idea of a universal tax body reform. So thank you for the many ideas that and the proposals you shared with us. And if you allow me, I would, and of course, Maria Teresa, the legally binding instrument on transnational corporations of human and human rights is a mandated process under the auspices of the Human Rights Council. I had the privilege to chair the working group in charge of crafting this new legally binding instrument. So there is a lot of issues to be considered by our speakers in the Q&A section, but allow me to give back the floor to Mandeep, since he's back with us again, and hopefully his connection will work this time. So you have the floor, because you were unable to finish your intervention, Mandeep. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you, and apologies that my connection went off. And if there's a challenge with the connection, please do let me know, and I can put my camera off. And I'm glad that Maria Teresa has already laid out several of the points that I wanted to discuss, and of course provide an overview on the. So I wanted to hone down, and I'll be brief here, on three particular issues from the OCA report. One is the new social contract and UN reform. The second is guaranteeing integrity in public information. And the third is engagement with civil society. So on the new social contract, the Secretary General talks about the need to forge one, to rebuild trust, to foster gender equal participation, and to ensure social protection. And importantly, the ST has called for reform of the Trusteeship Council. He's also called for looking at how civil society and other stakeholders engage with the UN system, and then even urged member states to look at creating a resolution on how this engagement with civil society and other stakeholders will take place at the UN General Assembly, at the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council. Now, in principle, all of this sounds very good and makes sense. But however, the big challenge and the elephant in the room is that the UN continues to operate in an extremely state-centric manner. So while we have this commitment in the UN Charter, which begins with the words, "we the peoples," but oftentimes we find that the way decisions are taken, the way deliberations are carried out, is very much along state-centric lines. And we know that in the current situation, where we have governments that have come to power through military takeovers, with the proliferation of coups, we really need to think about how the international system, how the UN can also have an alternative line of engagement with we the peoples and the people on the ground. There are some ideas there for UN reform, which are considered too ambitious or ahead of their time by some of them within the establishment at the moment. And here it's really critical that we start to look at ideas like a UN citizens initiative, people campaign, which talks about when a critical mass of global citizens can raise an issue. It could be an issue related to conflict, it could be an issue related to climate change, it could be an issue related to mass migration, and then the UN's decision-making forums would be obliged to discuss and act upon it. The second proposal that's there, which is to have some sort of direct representation at the UN through citizens panels or through a parliamentary assembly. These should start to be considered in earnest. So while we are looking in relation to the plans for the Summit of the Future, as well as the Social Development Summit, I think there more efforts need to be made to ensure that there's direct people's participation, there is more robust civil society participation, and perhaps it would be good if the General Assembly can discuss these. The second issue I wanted to pick up on is, of course, the integrity of public information, where the Secretary General has called for a code of conduct on public information. And I know that there's work that is being carried out within the UN on how to take this forward. Now, in engaging with this code of conduct on public information, the UN will need to take a far more robust stance against states that engage in industrial scale censorship, that engage in propaganda on a massive scale. And here, a plan of action needs to be put in place on how to implement the Secretary General's call to action on human rights, which was issued in 2020, and how to ensure that the guidance on civil space, which is there, needs to be put in place. Otherwise, the challenge is going to be that without further emphasis on these issues, there needs to be a scaffolding of civic space that needs to be provided. Otherwise, we will not be able to ensure integrity of public information. So I would say the call to action on human rights and the guidance on civic space need to go hand in hand with the code of conduct on public information. The third point I want to focus on is the engagement with civil society, and ESG has talked about it throughout the report, and there's many emphases of how civil society strengthens the work of the UN. And here there's a call to UN agencies to establish civil society focal points in case they haven't done so already. And here our proposal would be that the UN itself carries out an audit on how different departments, various agencies, various offices engage with civil society and develop a coalition of best practices on civil society engagement. But we need to go further beyond best practices, because if we just have focal points in various UN agencies, we'll need, we may not have the harmonization that is needed. And the Secretary General talks about a civil society champion in the report, but doesn't go so far as to suggest it along the lines of a envoy for future generations. So a civil society envoy can also help and ensure that the current inconsistencies in how UN engages with civil society can be overcome, and also can help drive the UN's outreach to civil society on the ground, as it's very challenging for civil society from all over the world to come and engage sometimes at where the centers of power of the UN, as it's not very easy even to get visas, for example, and given the current travel restrictions. So a civil society envoy can help drive this outreach and also help ensure better and more robust civil society participation. But let me stop there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share these proposals.
We have to thank you, Mandeep, and thank you also again for very specific recommendations that I think are very useful at this time. So without further ado, because we are a little behind schedule, I will open the floor for questions and answers. And if you allow me, I would like to call on Javier Suraski, because he asked also to speak on this section of our conversation. So Javier Suraski from CEPE, you have the floor.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda, and thank you, Ted and Mandeep, for your presentation. Both presentations were enlightening, really. I just want to highlight one or two very specific points. The first one is that we are still facing a massive problem of trust in the international community. I mean, we adopted the 2030 Agenda 6 years ago, and we are still seeing that states and non-state actors lack of the trust that the 2030 Agenda implementation requires. Without that trust, it will be very hard to improve the economic system and the economic relations between actors, because this lack of trust includes also, in some way, the relation between states and other stakeholders with the UN. And if we mention the relations with the IMF, then we can say that there is no trust at all. And if we look at the agreement between the United Nations and the IMF, we can see that that agreement is not to have the IMF as part of the United Nations, but it's an agreement that stops the United Nations to act with when the IMF takes some kind of decisions. So the problem of trust is still a major one if we want to solve the economic problem and create new tools to develop the strategies and to reach the OCA report goals or move forward the suggestions. However, we have some we have some strengths and weaknesses that I think we should consider. On the side of the strengths, there are a lot of people working in a very serious way for a long time on issues that we are debating here. It is impossible to mention all of them, but I invite you to read the reports of the intergovernmental expert group on international cooperation taxation matters. They are incredibly pointing out what the main problems are and suggesting solutions. So the problem is that the problem is not that we don't know the solutions. The problem is that we can move the required steps forward. And let me give you in a minute another example of what the lack of trust means. If you look at the Latin American and the Caribbean VNRs the last year, there were no. Let's consider the complete set of Latin American and the Caribbean VNRs presented since 2016. There are 44 VNRs. In almost each VNR, the country highlight that they are facing problems with data. In almost 25 VNRs, the country present plans they are developing to improve the data they have. Only 11 countries mention that they are establishing any kind of agreement or common work with non-state actors to improve data availability. Let me say in the opposite way. 33 of 44 reports do not mention any kind of effort to work with non-actor stakeholder to improve one of the biggest problems that the country is saying they have. And this is because of lack of trust. This is one of the main reasons behind this silence or the lack of will to work together. And finally, let me tell you that I think that we need to focus on how to move things forward. Because one more time, we have been debating for a long time on what the problems are and what the possible solutions are. Now, what we really need is a concrete strategic framework, call it whatever you want, to move things forward. We saw at the COP26, for example, what a blah blah conference means. We cannot accept that a conference for the future will be another blah blah conference. We don't have time, and we need to move things forward now. And at least partially, it depends on us.
Well, thank you very much, Javier. And I don't know, but I don't see any hands raised. So please do take the floor on these very two critical issues. I think that the issue of trust, I think, is at the center of the need to rethink a new social contract. I think that both Mandeep and Tetet and Javier address this critical issue. And it is not only this, I would say, the trust deficit pandemic that we are living. It's mistrust among citizens, mistrust between citizens and governments and democratic institutions, but also mistrust on the capacity of the multilateral system and multilateral international organizations in delivering and being, as efficient and as responsive as these current multiple crisis situation deserves. So I see Francia Serrano asking for the floor. Francia, you have the floor, and then I will give the floor to Fergus. Francia.
Hi, nice to meet you, everyone. I would like to say some words regarding to the sustainable financing. So, well, at the end, I would like to know his opinion. So I believe that an important part of the founding is aimed to human rights is to designate financial resources for digitalization and the development of open source tools that can be used by undeveloped countries. So this will not only contribute to the creation of more resilient cities, but also to reduce the economic gap between the countries. So also, this is an option to foster the knowledge economy that I think is essential in order to boost learning and innovation. And in consequence, it is to promote creative solutions and share good practices. So it's only congruent to the create more multilateral cooperation. So in the end, I consider that the OCA should emphasize more on the economy linked to the efficiency of creative and innovative processes and the distribution of global economic and yes, obviously the global knowledge economy. So this is only that. So thank you.
Thank you, Francia. Indeed, extremely important to resource and address seriously the digital gap between developed and developing countries, and to pay attention to the knowledge economy, because that's where perhaps transformation and creativity reside. So thank you for your contribution, Francia. And I would like to now give the floor to Fergus. Fergus, you have the floor.
Thanks, Maria. Just briefly, I'd like to maybe connect some of the themes from our previous hour with some of the comments that have been made here, and to support what Agustina raised with regard to the goals of a social summit. I wanted to add as a suggestion. I mean, Javier Saraski just made a very strong plea for not just talking about the what, the problems such as integrity of public information and tax reform and debt and so on, but our need for a strategy. So one suggestion that I would like to make is that perhaps this OCA recommendation of social protection floors could be something that could galvanize a range of campaigns and initiatives, because and also, you know, we have not a problem, but there is a gap between, you know, we're in early 2022 and the social summit is projected for 2025, and in the meantime, states could begin the states and others could begin mobilizing around the idea of social protection floors. They're going to be implemented, of course, nationally, but the Secretary General calls for a small fund, and there could be some normative push around this idea, and you know, different states will implement the social protection floors in their own way, but it might be an issue that helps build momentum towards the social summit, and in the course of doing so, also on some of these economic sustainable development issues. So that's just a strategic suggestion.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, Fergus, but certainly while you were speaking, I was also thinking that we need 3 or 4 common denominators that we will bring from the education summit to the summit for of the future to the social summit in 2025. I mean, they cannot be isolated, standalone, separate processes, but we really need to weave as some kind of rationale, because we are basically what we're saying, we need a social contract. So we have a pact on how to live better, more equal, and more sustainable. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. And I think we cannot see these summits as separate silos, but to build. And of course, the social protection floors can be one of these critical issues that we bring all the way from 2022 to 2025. So I think it's really a great idea. I see the hand from Maya Groff. Maya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Maria, and lovely to see and hear everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to raise this proposal and initiative that many of you already know about, but for a new international corruption court, which is an international campaign which is gathering a lot of momentum. And of course, the issue of corruption across a broad diversity of countries around the world, you know, speaks to issues of financing for basic health, for education, for the SDGs in general, to address the climate challenge. For example, it's estimated about 3.6 trillion is lost yearly to corruption, to the global economy. So these are very large international funds, and often they're countries in the global south, for example, leaderships and individuals siphon off public monies, and then this is enabled by financial institutions in the global north, for example. So it also speaks to, you know, north-south inequalities and exploitative parts of our global financial and economic system. Illicit financial flows, of course, and this core issue of building trust. We should all have trust in our leaderships in every country to make sure they lead with integrity, without corruption. So just to say that the Canadian government has officially come out to support this initiative, and a number of other governments are interested, as well as civil society groups and activists around the world. And Nobel Peace Prize laureates, for example, a whole range have signed a declaration of support, a number of former heads of state. So the effort now is to, you know, build awareness and engagement and dialogue about how to design an effective court, but also to design a court, an institution which is effective, which is also serving the citizens of the world, that isn't a global north institution, that is truly a helpful, supportive international institution. So I just think it's also an opportunity to see how, you know, progressive states taking the leadership to have some ambition to make changes and to build the capacity of the international community to really to take on some of these bigger challenges. And we know there have to be bigger steps forward across a range of areas. So yeah, I hope there's a civil society declaration. So please join and sign on to that. And I hope this is, you know, kind of a glimmer of also what's to come in terms of states and civil society and experts, professionals working together to really move forward with excellence in a new generation of global governance.
Thank you very much, Maya, for reminding us of this powerful initiative of the establishment of an international anti-corruption court and the connections between fighting corruption and financing sustainable development. So please do join, as Maya mentioned, and I think that can be yet another success of of bold and creative ideas from civil society, like the establishment of the International Criminal Court. So thank you, Maya, for that. I see Nobil, followed by Agustina. Just reminding you that we are 8 minutes away from the end of our conversation, so please be quick, sharp, and bold in 2 minutes, so I can give the floor back to Mandeep and Tetet so they can have the final word. So Nobil, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll speak maybe from a space, from a global context, but from a space where, trust building is very important. Looking at it from the context of civic society itself working with government, and government also being the ones that are also accountable, let's say, to the global UN system itself, and how that's more of the Africa context, and even some other continents where civic society is mainly viewed as like agents of regime change or agents of the West, and that mistrust that now exists even from the continental space, let's say like from Africa itself. AU just had its heads of state meetings, and part of their recommendations to the UN was, issues of saying more representation for African countries, given, the conflicts that are there. That lack of trust, you can see that lack of trust of the African state itself with the UN, and how the UN also, in some instances here, has been complicit in some of the antagonizing kind of like activities between CSOs and the state itself in terms of funding. And I think we need to have something that speaks deliberately to how then do we build back better in structuring the relationship between CSOs in different continents, not just Africa only, with their member states, with their governments, so that it's easy for the state itself to be able to implement collectively with civic society to deliver on some of these globally accepted or globally set benchmarks, whether we're talking of the SDGs, whether we're talking of the some of the commitments that we've made at a global level, because as long as we don't look at it from that level, it's problematic in how we're going to deliver on those. And also maximizing on some of the reforms that the UN is taking place right now in reshaping how state and civic society work together to deliver on some of these global agendas that we have. Because if we don't, we'll simply just be chasing our tails, because if civic society and governments cannot work together, then it's a recipe for disaster and all these issues that we're pushing for. So I think we need to also look at that more closely. For time, maybe I'll just end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nobil. So no building back better without civil society and without social ownership. I think this is absolutely critical. So Agustina, you have the floor, and then I will give back the floor to our two speakers for their last word. Agustina.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Just a final reflection from my part on the advocacy part, that I totally agree with what you said. I actually wanted to add that comment to the end of my presentation in the first part, of not seeing the UN process as different summits, but trying to give it a coherence, because there are issues that are cross-cutting as well. But and for us to focus our advocacy efforts that way. But my concern here, and also for us to discuss with the Coalition for the UN we need, is that lots of the organizations that are part of the Coalition for the UN we need, or other partners, as the Club de Madrid with the World Social Summit, we have our own star recommendations or our own initiatives, where I think that we should think of a process to kind of join forces, not only towards the UN process, but towards our own initiatives, and maybe as part of the Coalition for the UN we need. Because if we join forces at the civil society and we properly map what we are each doing, I think that will give us much more strength going forward, and to make sure which organizations want to support different processes, no? In the sense that towards World Social Summit, for example, I know that from Club de Madrid, we will also want to be present at or send input to the future World Summit. So just that consideration of how we can improve that coordination amongst ourselves and civil society. And just as a last comment, also for us to be aware of, and this is not to be, I think we all need to be idealistic in a certain sense, it's part of that activism, but I think we need to be very conscious of the enabling environment that is needed at times to give that jump. We have a crisis, a triple crisis. That's a time of opportunity, but we also know that the political leadership may be missing and may be lacking. And I think that's something that we all need to be aware of. It's a cause for urgency, as I was saying before, but also something that I think we all need to be very cautious of, particularly in our outreach to member states and in identifying champions. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustina. I think right on, we cannot agree more with you, and we have to be mindful of what is the political environment and the sort of allies we need among member states. That's absolutely critical. So I will give back the floor to Mandeep for a closing statement, and then I would let Tete have the last word.
Thank you very much. And I won't take time knowing that we are almost at the end. I just say that perhaps as part of the conversations at the General Assembly, the universality of Agenda 2030 and the interdependent nature of the goals is something that the UN really needs to focus on, because states have this tendency to cherry pick the goals. They have this tendency to pull out certain goals where they feel aligned with their own political objectives. And that's really is one of the problems that we are facing now, with the lack of implementation of the agenda in its holistic way, and also about non-realization of some of the rights-based underpinnings, the transformative nature of Agenda 2030. And I think the same goes for the Our Common Agenda report, because if we start to look at the OCA in what is feasible and what is practicable, perhaps we may have missed an opportunity to ensure that we actually have a UN that's fit for purpose for a 21st century world, for a world in which citizens and people are going to be far more involved in shaping the decisions that impact their lives than they may be in the 2022 scenario. But in 2030 or 2040, the world might look very different. So I think we need to start making those shifts in the summits that the Secretary General has proposed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mandeep. And I will pass immediately to Tete.
Thank you very much. Before we end, I'd like to challenge everyone here that we should all try to correct the severe symptoms of gastrocerebral imbalance that is affecting almost everyone. You know, what the mind says is very much different from what the stomach is actually feeling. So I think all our conversations around equality versus equity, it's not just about having a seat at the table, but making sure that this table delivers on resources and opportunities needed to reach an outcome that is just, because it is transformative. Now, people need to see and feel that multilateralism delivers tangible results to improve their lives. And only then can we restore trust. Only then can we have broad ownership of OCA, and only then can we see people mobilizing in support of OCA. Only then can we say that this is really our common agenda, and hopefully with this, we can restore trust in the institutions of multilateralism and really achieve the aspirations of genuine sustainable development. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Ted. I cannot, think of a better way to close this conversation. So I will just keep quiet and say thank you very much. This has been extremely, extremely fruitful, creative, diverse, bold, a huge menu of alternatives, of recommendations. A very, very, I would say, powerful dialogue today. And that was, I think, the whole purpose of having this preparation moment before the PGA consultation process. So thank you very much. Don't forget that we still have 2 more to come. So please stay tuned. And perhaps I would give the floor to our C4UN Secretariat for the last word to see what are the next step and what follows. So Fergus, Jeff, and thank you again.
Well, thank you, Maria. And just to say that we will try and distill a very short, not for attribution, just summary of the conversation that picks up some of the key themes in order to distribute, and we'll send it to our speakers and moderators just for a check, and just to have an outcome from this discussion, so that as what we're doing is we're beginning the process of engagement with the intergovernmental process, and that's our goal. We're still at a very early stage in the overall consideration of the OCA, so I completely agree with you that this has been a great menu of recommendations, and which is appropriate to the political moment, and we look forward to the next meeting in the middle of the month.
Wonderful. Jeff, you would like to add something, please?
No, just in that regard, I just everyone is invited, and stay tuned for our next expert dialogue, which is going to be taking place on Friday, the 18th of February, where we will be interrogating the OCA paragraphs and the themes that will engage the third thematic cluster discussion of the General Assembly.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff and Fergus, and thank you all, because it's been, I would say, a very energizing way to start the week. So have a great week. Don't forget the 18th of February, our second expert dialogue meeting. So stay tuned, and thank you very much once again. See you very soon.
Thank you, everybody.